Developing motion picture film is a delicate business, which is why motion picture labs use machine processors that look like this. Long, large machines that have deep chemical tanks with regulated temperatures that pull hundreds or thousands of feet of film through them pretty easily. Very nice. Not necessarily something you're going to pick up for yourself and set up in a bathroom, but very nice. Developing yourself, though, is a big part of shooting film for many people, primarily in the photography community. It lets you understand the medium better and explore experimental processes and really just kind of take control of your own work on film. It's a fun and expansive topic. Deving photo film yourself at home, easy, accessible, pretty neat. Listen, photo film rolls are like 5 feet long, usually 35mm or larger, which means pretty easy to handle, and developing tanks are easy to get and to use. Developing cinema film at home, kind of a whole other beast. Suddenly you're working with 50 or 100 feet of film, but there is a lot of transferable knowledge between photo developing and cinema developing. The biggest roadblock for developing motion picture film is usually the options for the developing tanks themselves. The most popular one that comes to mind is the Lomo tank. This is an old Soviet-era Bakelite plastic developing tank. Super 8, 16mm, or 35mm film is loaded onto these spirals in the dark, and then you can develop in the light by pouring chemistry into the top and then draining it out of the hose. The Lomo tanks usually come in 50-foot and 100-foot sizes, so these spirals will hold 50 feet of film, or there's these smaller models where each spiral will take 25 feet of film. Then each tank will allow for stacking 2 spirals. So for example, you can have 50 feet of film on the bottom and 50 feet of film on the top for a total of 100 feet of film in the tank. These tanks aren't bad, but they're brittle and they break easily, and also they're expensive for the quality that they are. For example, a spiral might have a crack or like a chip in it, and something that's small can make loading them much more difficult. It's also a pain when you're working with 16mm because 16mm comes in 100 or 400 foot rolls. So if you're developing a 100 foot roll in one of these tanks, then you have to actually cut it in 2 so that you can have 2 50-foot rolls. There's also the Morse tank. Sometimes more solidly built and often with metal reels inside, this tank can take 16mm, 35mm, and even Super 8 if you have these specific plastic reels. You load your roll onto the reel and attach the other end to the second reel. Then as you develop, you wind the film back and forth. Morse tanks can also be decent, but they can be hard to achieve a consistent development with because you have to wind the film back and forth at a good speed. Those are the 2 tanks that are the most popular for developing cinema film manually, and the drawback to them is that they're old and they can just break easily. 3D printing is also an option that people have explored for these tanks, and there do exist 3D models for tanks that people have made for printing. It's important to keep in mind the quality that these need to be printed, and of course that they'll be used with a variety of chemistry. You may also be able to replace certain broken Lomo tank components with 3D printed ones, which is very cool. There's also a Super 8/16mm drum for Jobo processors that will hold 50 feet of Super 8 or about 32 feet of 16mm. This isn't something I've ever personally used though. Now instead of using those tanks for developing in this video, I'm going to use this incredibly nice brand new developing tank from FilmoMat. FilmoMat is based in Germany, and they make this tank as well as this very fancy bespoke FilmoMat automatic processor. Right up front here, I'm gonna say that this tank is an expensive one on an individual scale. It's 1,500 euros, which is over $2,000 Canadian or $1,600 American, so it's not going to be for everyone, and I feel that it's much more aimed at schools, art centers, and community darkrooms that want to be able to have something much more reliable than a Lomo or a Morse tank. I really love this thing. I think it's one of the nicest pieces of gear that I could ever imagine owning, and an incredibly big thank you to Lucas, who is behind FilmoMat, for sending me this. I'm going to show off this tank in detail, but also a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is transferable to using the Lomo tank as well, because they're very, very similar in design, and also just talking about developing in general with this stuff. Based off of the FilmoMat website, the tank and its cap are CNC milled out of solid PVC. This material is not only chemically resistant, but also extremely sturdy and durable. The cap is held in place by a light-proof bayonet lock. The film spirals are supported by stainless steel discs, which keep the film in place. Right now, this is set up for two 100-foot rolls of 16mm. On top is this spindle that screws onto the center stem. Then there's a stainless steel disc. Below that is a metal spacer and then a 100-foot spiral. The spirals are plastic, but very sturdy and slightly flexible as well. Below this is a nut that screws onto the stem, and then another stainless steel disc, a spacer, and a second 100-foot spiral, all on a metal base. So this tank has two 100-foot spirals, allowing for the tank to hold up to 200 feet in total. For Super 8 film, the steel disc just sits right on top of the spiral. For 16mm, a spacer is used and then the steel disc. And for 35mm, both spacers and the nut are put on top of the spiral and then the steel disc. The tank can be set up in a few different ways by using these gray spacers that are labeled based on the combination of film. Two Super 8 spirals, one Super 8 and one 16 spiral, a single 16 spiral, and a single Super 8 spiral. There's also a piece to help tighten and loosen the nut. For example, if you want to just use one spiral in the tank that's spaced for 16mm film, then you first use the metal spacer, then the steel disc goes on top of that, followed by the proper gray spacer, and then the spindle. For putting a spiral space for Super 8 on top of a 16mm one, screw on the nut, place the second spiral, and then the disc right on top of that, then the proper gray spacer, followed by the spindle. Loading these spirals is done exactly the same way as loading the spirals on the old Lomo tanks. In the middle of the spiral is a place that the film will kind of slot into. The end of the film slots into this and you make a little V shape with a crease before bending it around so that it's coming straight into the middle off of your roll. My example roll here is slightly incorrect because the perforations of the film should be down and not up as seen here. Stack the appropriate pieces on top of the spiral and then angle the film slightly so that it comes in at about a 45-degree angle to the spiral. You want to be loading your film onto the spiral with the emulsion of the film facing out. The FilmoMat tank has a nice little platform that the spiral can sit on and spin very easily, so loading should be pretty smooth. Keep your film angled and spin the spiral clockwise and your film should just all load onto it properly. Tuck the end of the film on the reel, cutting it if you need to, and you should have a perfect spiral. You'll very much want to practice this whether on the Lomo tank or the FilmoMat one because you have to load this in complete darkness unless you're using some orthochromatic film. So prepare to sacrifice a roll or get a bunch of leader if you don't have old film to waste. Loading Super 8 is the same, just smaller, so a little more fiddly. On these 100-foot spirals, a 50-foot roll of Super 8 will only fill half of it. So in theory, you could staple together two rolls and load them both onto one spiral. But again, maybe practice before you tackle that. And 35mm is the same as well, but just bigger. So maybe easier or just as difficult because it takes a bit of work to make sure it's kind of sitting properly. But man, is loading this film onto a spiral like this satisfying when you do it properly. The spirals sit inside of the tank and then the lid just rotates and locks into place. To be entirely honest with you, I'm still pretty new to processing motion picture film by hand. I'm very, very lucky to have easy access to Niagara Custom Lab here in Toronto, which is a cinema film lab where I can take my Super 8 and 16mm pretty easily for developing and transferring. Developing motion picture film can be tricky, and I'm still learning it on the manual side of developing myself. For developing film, whether cinema or photographic, there's 4 main processes: black and white negative, black and white reversal, color negative, and color reversal. You can get kits for these developing processes from a variety of manufacturers, and I've covered all of these for photography film in videos on the channel already. These processes are generally the same processes as motion picture film as well. Any black and white negative developer that you might use for something such as a roll of HP5 can also be used for 16mm rolls of XX or Orwo film, and different developers, of course, will give you different results, just like photo film. The same goes for Ektachrome and Super 8 and 16mm. It's the same E6 process that photography rolls of Ektachrome use, so you can use an E6 kit from someone like Tetanol for cinema rolls as well. For color negative, photography film uses C41 chemistry, and Kodak Color cinema film uses a process called ECN2. They're both the same steps and involve developing, bleaching, and fixing, but ECN2 basically is meant to yield a lower contrast negative. You could still use a C41 kit for developing some Super 8 Vision 3 film, for example, but the results will likely be just a bit different from a lab using ECN2. You can get ECN2 kits as well though, because shooting stills with cinema film these days is super hot. Developing color cinema film in a tank like this, or just in general, is made a bit more difficult because of that remjet carbon backing on Vision 3 cinema stocks. These color negative films have a backing that is normally removed in machine processors that have jets of water to clear it entirely before it hits the developer. It is only there on the Vision 3 Kodak stocks though, and it's not there on Ektachrome, so if you really want to develop color and not worry about the remjet backing, then shell out for Ektachrome. Removing this in a manual process is best done by using a pre-wash to clear some of the backing before developing, and then finding a way to wipe off any remaining backing using something like a soft sponge while the film is hanging to dry, which can be a bit tough when we're handling 50 or 100 feet of film, but developing color cinema film by hand is entirely possible in tanks like this. I want to show off this tank in action and just start with black and white negative developing in this video, but I do intend to cover more cinema film developing in the future videos. This tank is pretty big, so I'm actually gonna go use a real darkroom space for this. We're finally doing videos in a real darkroom. This is the darkroom here at LIFT, and LIFT is the Liaison of Independent Filmmakers of Toronto, and you can find information for that in the description below. The size of this tank and the amount of water that I need for developing this amount of film makes it hard to do at home, so using an actual darkroom will make it much easier. It's not impossible to do at home if you just want to do it in a sink, but because I have access to a darkroom, I may as well use a darkroom. So I've got the FilmoMat developing tank, and I'm gonna start off by just doing some black and white negative 16mm film. I'm gonna develop 100 feet of it, and it is some Kodak 3378 film stock, which I mentioned before in a previous video, but it's actually super high contrast, very low ISO film stock that was meant to be used for printing optical soundtracks onto originally. But you can shoot it in a camera like a Bolex or something like that, and you can develop it as black and white negative or black and white reversal. I said it's 100 feet, but it's actually probably like 80 feet or something like that. I shot a little bit of it just as a test originally, so there's not quite 100 feet on this daylight spool. Since developing that roll of 3378, I also developed a roll of Kodak XX black and whites. So I'll show off the process of black and white negative developing and results for both of these rolls. To get started, I have to load this roll into the tank in complete darkness. No red light can be used for this XX film, but because the 3378 was orthochromatic and lacked red sensitivity, I was actually able to load that roll with a red safe light on in the darkroom. Also, sometimes I like to toss on an old Starbucks apron that I stole when I quit that job so that I can always remember how much I hated it. For this, we're going to use Kodak Dectol Developer. So this has been mixed from a powder packet, and it is the concentrate version of it. So it is about 4 liters of just pure Dectol. So in order for it to be really usable, we're going to dilute it. So I'm going to dilute it 1 part Dectol to 3 parts water. And I need 2 liters of chemistry in order to develop 100 feet of 16mm film. So it's going to be 500 milliliters of Dectol to 1500 milliliters of water. Now, if you've done developing before, the process for mixing the chemistry here is the same, so I'm not going to cover it in detail. I'm mixing 2 liters of developer, which is, as mentioned, 3:1 from Dectol concentrate, that was previously mixed from a powder using the instructions just on the package. I'll also mix 2 liters of stop bath from some Kodak stop bath. Normally, for black and white developing, I might just rinse the film instead of using stop bath, but because this is so much film, I'm going to use real stop bath. And I've already mixed fix, so I have that just ready to go. I'll develop this at the standard black and white negative developing temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 minutes. The chemistry gets poured into the tank through the hose, so I have a funnel that fits perfectly into the end of that. I'm still getting used to how fast I can kind of pour the chemistry into the tank, and I'm moving a little slow here, but I should be able to do it in about 15 seconds if I pour nice and quickly and not have it overflow. During developing, I can rotate the spindle to move the film in the tank. For these 2 rolls, I was actually rotating it almost the entire time continuously, which I immediately realized after I finished was not how I should be doing it. Just like agitating photo film, you don't need to do it continuously. For this, you should only be rotating it about 10 seconds every minute, and you can lift the spindle up and down to shake air bubbles off of the film. Once the developing is done, I drain the tank by putting the jug on the floor with the hose inside, and then tip the tank to drain my chemistry. I repeat this process for the stop bath to cease all developing on the film. Once that's done and the tank is drained, I follow it up with fixing, which is of course the final step in the black and white negative process. With the fix drained, I rinse the film. This darkroom sink hose is very conveniently able to fit right inside the tank hose, so I'll rinse it that way, but you can also just let the tank sit under the tap for a few minutes. And just like with black and white photo developing, I'm using a final rinsing agent to help the film dry without spots on it. Let the film sit in that for a minute or 2 and it's done. Very much the same as developing photo film, but on a bigger scale. By far my least favorite part about hand developing 100 feet of film, or potentially more if I were to fill up the tank and do like 200 feet of film, is drying it easily. Right now in this darkroom we don't have one of those old school racks that you can kind of spin and spiral up your film around it. We can make one, which I think is probably the way to go because those older ones are expensive, but we have some racks above the sink and it's just an awkward time trying to hang 100 feet across these racks, but I just have to do my best at the moment. My solution for hanging the film to dry currently is to carefully wind the film back onto a spool while it's still wet. This makes that much amount of film easier to handle. Trying to just pull it off of the spiral in the tank results in it getting tangled very easily, but winding it onto a spool means I can just unroll it as I hang it to dry. The experience with this tank has been great. It loads so smooth and it's incredibly satisfying to have 100 feet of film on one of these spirals. When it's full of chemistry, it's pretty heavy. In fact, it's pretty heavy when it's empty as well. And you want to be setting yourself up in a way that filling and draining it won't be too difficult. I had it in the sink when I was doing it, but I think it's better to have it on the counter and then it's easier to tip for draining it into a jug that I just put on the floor with the hose in. With the Lomo tanks, you pour in the chemistry through the top, which is easier, but it's not a significant drawback that this tank requires you to pour it in through the hose. It just means if I were pouring 3 liters of chemistry into the tank, I would maybe want to find a way to clip the hose to the wall or something, maybe have a friend help me out with it so I can have both hands free to pour the chemistry. The Lomo tank hose can also be slipped into a spot on the side of the tank to ensure no chemistry escapes when we're processing. The handles on the FilmoMat tank are too narrow to slip the hose between, so I find it's easier to either hold the hose up or just make sure that it's propped up so that you're not accidentally draining chemistry out of the tank while you're developing. It's a large tank, and keeping the temperature consistent during developing is something to keep in mind. The darkroom is nice and warm, so my black and white developer temperature wasn't going to drastically change over the 5 minutes because it runs at room temperature anyways. For doing color film, that's maybe when I would have it sit in the sink filled with just a bit of warm water. The tank is nice and thick though, so I wouldn't be very worried about my temperature changing as long as the temperature in the room just isn't that cold. So once you've developed some Super 8 or 16mm, what's next? It's awesome to tackle this process for yourself, but this is where things kind of diverge again from the workflow of developing photography film. A developed roll of photo film is easy enough to scan at home using a flatbed film scanner, a cheap scanning unit, a macro camera transferring setup. You could print your frames in a darkroom using an enlarger, just a variety of possibilities that aren't necessarily expensive or difficult for you to do yourself to see your pictures. With motion picture film, you suddenly have 50 or 100 feet of film that isn't necessarily the easiest thing to handle and to digitize, and especially to print yourself. With Super 8, really the only somewhat affordable scanning unit for home use is the Wolverine or the Kodak Reels, which honestly do a pretty poor job when compared against a lab scan or even a quality telecine. There are DIY projects that people have made for capturing these individual frames and combining them so that you can watch your footage, but these can be difficult to build and assemble and not necessarily the most accessible for everyone. Or you can project your film and record the projection and maybe even do so using a special telecine setup such as this projector with a macro lens from Film Digital that I covered in a recent video. I'm incredibly happy with the results I got off of that setup. Printing motion picture film negatives to a positive for projection and or editing requires the use of a printer that can run the developed film and expose it frame by frame onto unexposed print stock. So not something that you can easily accomplish on your own. Really, in the end, you might just choose to send your developed film to a lab or transfer house for them to scan it using a high quality scanner like a Film Fabrique or a Laser Graphics. Even though you've developed the film yourself, you might end up back at a lab anyways. For my 2 rolls, I just did a quick telecine also here at Lift using a 16mm projector into a 4K camera. The 3378 is crazy contrasty, which is exactly how this film looks when you shoot it in a camera because it's not originally meant for that. It's exposed at 12 ISO in the Bolex, and I just shot some stuff very quickly to kind of get through a roll to have to develop. 3378 is a very cool film to get experimental with, and if you find places that sell it, then it's usually pretty cheap in comparison to standard film stocks in 16mm. The developing on this looks pretty even considering it's like my first time doing it, so I'm pretty proud about that. It's not the best looking footage just because I was walking around with the Bolex. The negative itself has some drying spots, as does my XX film, but this can probably be eliminated by using some distilled water in my final rinse, just like I do with photo film, because Toronto has very hard tap water, which I've found often gives me drying marks on the film.
The XX looks okay, but has an inconsistency to it, which I believe is probably the result of too much agitation during the development. I also exposed this stuff at box speed of 200 ISO in the Bolex. The telecity has its limits, and this would all benefit from a better scan, of course, but this is really just stuff that I wanted to transfer quickly to see the results of my developing in order to learn and get better at it as I go along.
Developing your own motion picture film is a great learning experience, and there's a ton of room for experimental filmmaking and unique processes. It isn't something that I would recommend absolute beginners jump into though, because it can be difficult and still pretty expensive. If you're shooting Super 8 for the first time, send it to a lab and instead focus on learning the basics of shooting, the camera use, and the different film types before also adding developing and transferring onto that skill set. Jumping into this and hoping to achieve lab quality results just isn't going to be realistic when you first start. Be prepared to make mistakes and shoot test rolls even though the film is expensive. It just takes a lot of work to get good at doing this yourself. In terms of getting chemistry for a tank like this, for developing one roll of Super 8 or 16mm, you need between 1.5 and 2 liters of chemistry. Mixing that much black and white developer isn't too difficult or expensive and is definitely the cheapest place to start. But for filling this tank entirely, I need as much as 3 to 4 liters. That's quite a bit when we're talking about like color negative or color reversal especially. For C41 and E6 chemistry, that's going to run you easily over $100 for that much. And if you want to use actual ECN2 chemistry instead of a C41 kit, then that's likely going to be even more expensive. I'm lucky again to have a local motion picture film lab and have the option of buying chemistry directly from them as well, but many will have to rely on using kits intended for photo film. Chemistry for Tri-X reversal is also difficult. I've covered my own black and white reversal developing process already here on the channel, but it isn't the easiest thing to accomplish. It's great to buy reversal chemistry from a motion picture lab if you have that option, but you might have to explore either mixing that stuff from scratch using the individual chemistry components or tracking down a black and white reversal kit, which can be a bit rare depending on where you are in the world. If you're using a 100-foot Lomo tank, then obviously you use less chemistry in comparison to the FilmoMat tank. That tank needs between 1 to 2 liters of chemistry depending on what you're developing, in comparison to the 1.5 to 3.5 liters of the FilmoMat. The Morse tank is similar and also takes just about 1 to 2 liters of chemistry depending on what you're developing in that as well. The FilmoMat tank is the best option I could ever imagine for developing such a large amount of film by hand. It's incredibly well put together, it's super sturdy, and still based on that Lomo design that works well as long as your tank isn't cracked and old. As I mentioned, the FilmoMat tank costs 1,500 euros, but it's currently sold out at the time of making this video because it does take them time to assemble these. You can find the FilmoMat website in the description below, so just keep an eye on that and their social media to find out when they'll be available again. Obviously, the big appeal of the FilmoMat tank is just the size of it. The fact that you can load an entire 100-foot roll of 16mm onto one spiral is awesome, and you don't have to split it up like with most of the Lomo tank models out there, or do the back and forth processing like with the Morse tank. Being able to do up to 200 feet in one tank is just so impressive. If you keep an eye out, you might come across someone selling a 200-foot Lomo tank. These are rare and basically the same as the FilmoMat tank in terms of how big the spiros are. They're usually expensive when they show up for sale, and considering how old and how easily they break or crack, it's a bit of a risky purchase. I'm getting more confident with this, but it'll take some time before I want to do like 200 feet of color negative 16mm or staple together 4 rolls of Super 8 so that I can do them all at once in one go. But I can definitely do that with this tank.
It's expensive, but it's fantastic for what it is, and I hope that it finds its way to people who are doing a lot of this work themselves, or especially institutions, schools, and like artist centers that will make great use of it.
Thank you so much for checking this out. Thank you especially to Lucas and for everybody who's doing their stuff over at FilmoMat. It's obviously a lot of passion and care goes into this, and especially the automatic film processor, which maybe sometime in the future it would be awesome to look at one of those things. You can check out all the information for that at the link in the description below for FilmoMat's website. And you can also find information for LIFT here in Toronto, which is the Liaison of Independent Filmmakers of Toronto, which is where I was at for doing the darkroom work, and I also do just a lot of work in general there. And they are an amazing resource. They have a lot of different facilities and access to different gear, and you can find all of that information down in the description below, along with options for supporting the channel to kind of keep this going. And you know, I want to do more developing of motion picture film, and even though I have the tank and access to the darkroom and stuff like that, film and chemistry and everything is expensive. So any support from anybody always goes a long way for making this stuff, you know, more possible in the future and allowing me to cover progressively larger and larger topics. So there's links to the Patreon as well as a little bit of merch and some stuff like that down in the description. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.